He played his final notes to a roaring stadium, the lights hot enough to turn sweat into steam, and never once felt the blade already resting against his back. The biggest bands in history all carried the same quiet secret. They cut loose the very hands that built their sound. What happens when the architects of a legend are erased from the story they helped write? This is the story of guitarists abandoned by their own bands, deleted from the myth at the exact moment the myth became immortal. In the summer of 1962, Pete Best was the drummer for the most exciting band in Liverpool. He had been behind the kit since 1960, through the sweaty, cigarette-choked nights in Hamburg and the fevered lunchtime sessions at the Cavern Club. The Beatles were on the verge of something enormous, and Pete Best was part of that sound, part of that pulse, part of that story. Then, on the 16th of August, the telephone rang in his family home, and the story simply carried on without him. Brian Epstein, the band's manager, delivered the news in a single call. There was no meeting, no discussion, no warning of any kind. According to the Beatles' Bible and later accounts in The Guardian, Pete Best heard the words from the other end of the line while standing in his own house. The man who had driven the beat through hundreds of performances was told, in essence, that he was no longer required. Just 2 months later, in October of 1962, the band released their first single, Love Me Do. But have you ever wondered what it actually means to be erased from a record? In Pete Best's case, the erasure was literal. He had played on only 10 official recording sessions with the group, and when Love Me Do was finalised, his drum track was wiped completely. Ringo Starr was brought in to re-record the part, and the original performance simply vanished from the tape. The Beatles' Bible documents this in detail, and the fact remains stark. The first sounds the world heard from the most famous band in history did not include the man who had been there from the start. The fans at the Cavern Club did not accept the change quietly. A protest movement erupted almost immediately, with banners reading "Best Forever, Ringo Never" held high in the dim, brick-walled cellar where the band had built their following. The Beatles' Bible and The Independent both record the fury of those early devotees. Girls wept in the street. Boys shouted their anger at Epstein. For a brief moment, the decision seemed genuinely dangerous. And then the single came out, and the machine moved forward, and the protests faded into memory. What followed for Pete Best was a long, quiet unravelling. He did not find another great band. He did not ride the wave of the British invasion. Instead, according to The Guardian, he took a job as a bread worker in a Liverpool bakery, and he kept that job for 20 years. 20 years of early mornings and flour on his hands, while 4 men he had once called his bandmates conquered the planet. He eventually returned to music with a local group, and in 1992 he published a memoir, Inside the Beatles, which sold more than 100,000 copies, as noted by the New York Times Book Review. Here is the image that should linger. The Beatles became the most celebrated band of all time, their faces printed on 1 billion bedroom walls, their songs hummed in every language on earth. Meanwhile, the man who once sat behind their drum kit was counting loaves of bread in a working-class Liverpool shop, invisible to the world he had helped set in motion. And if that is what happened to the drummer, you have to ask, what did they do to the man who founded the band? The story of Brian Jones begins not with a firing but with a founding. He was the one who placed the advertisement in Jazz News in 1962, the one who named the band after a Muddy Waters song, and the one who recruited Mick Jagger and Keith Richards into what would become the Rolling Stones. For those first few years, he was the shimmering centre of the thing, a blonde apparition with a slide guitar style that no one else in England had yet imagined. Rolling Stone magazine would later note that he was among the first musicians anywhere to push the slide guitar into rock, a pioneer whose shadow stretched all the way to the Allman Brothers. The band climbed on the strength of his taste, his ear, his strange and delicate feel for the blues. But the machinery he set in motion had other plans for him. By 1967, the songwriting partnership of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had hardened into a closed shop, and the band's creative core simply moved around him. That year, the album Between the Buttons became the last record on which he played a full and equal part, and after it, according to Rolling Stone magazine, he was credited with exactly 1 song on Aftermath. While Jagger and Richards were writing Ruby Tuesday, Jones was being turned into a hired hand in the group he had built with his own hands. The slide guitar that once defined their sound was now decoration, ornamental flourishes on songs that no longer needed him. He had gone from founder to ghost in the space of a few recording sessions. Then came the conversation that ended it. On June 8, 1969, Jones was called in and told that the band no longer required his services, the official phrasing pointing to creative differences, a polite way of saying that the architects had decided the foundation was expendable. He was 27 years old, and he walked out of that room having been removed from the one institution he had ever truly belonged to. The band scheduled a press event at Hyde Park in London 2 weeks later, a free concert meant to launch a new era with a new guitarist. It would go on without him, and 50,000 people would gather in the open air, some of them unaware that the man who had named the band was already gone from it. What happened next has been picked over for decades, but the facts remain stark. On July 3, 1969, 1 month after his dismissal, Brian Jones was found at the bottom of the swimming pool at Cochford Farm in Sussex, the country house he had bought years earlier. He was 27, the first and perhaps the most haunting member of what the BBC later called the 27 Club, a grim roll call that would eventually include Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse. The man who had struck the match on one of the greatest rock bands in history was dead before that band had finished its first farewell tour without him. And yet the erasure did not end at the grave. Jones was buried at Bouncers Lane Cemetery in Cheltenham, but the headstone that should have carried his name carried nothing for 10 years. Not until 1979, a full decade after his death, was the inscription finally carved into the stone: Brian Jones, founder of the Ramones. His name had been quietly removed from book titles and film projects about the band, his contributions reduced to footnotes, his face cropped from the official story. The question that hangs over all of it is simple enough. How does the person who gave a band its name, its first sound, and its first members become the one person that same band spends half a century forgetting? The man who built the house was turned away at the door, and the world only remembered to say his name when it was far too late. Before the drugs took him apart, Syd Barrett was the brightest star in the London underground. He founded Pink Floyd, named the band, and wrote nearly every song on their debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, released in 1967. That record did not merely introduce a band, it announced a new way of hearing. Its songs were short, strange, and lit from within by a kind of nursery rhyme menace that no one else on the scene could touch. Then came the unravelling. Barrett was diagnosed with schizophrenia, though many researchers now argue the truth was closer to severe bipolar disorder, compounded by an astonishing intake of psychedelics. By some estimates, he consumed hundreds of doses of LSD in 1967 alone. His behaviour grew so erratic on stage and in the studio that the band quietly decided they could no longer carry him. In January 1968, they replaced him with David Gilmour, and the founder of Pink Floyd became a ghost at his own funeral. He managed 2 solo albums, The Madcap Laughs and Barrett, both released in 1970, and then he simply stopped. No farewell tour, no final statement. He withdrew to Cambridge, where he spent nearly 4 decades penning and refusing every invitation to return to music. The man who once stood at the centre of the psychedelic revolution never played another note in public. But the strangest chapter was still to come. In 1975, Pink Floyd were at Abbey Road Studios recording Shine On You Crazy Diamond, a song written in open tribute to Barrett. Midway through the session, a heavy-set man with shaved eyebrows walked into the control room and stood silently near the back. The band glanced at him without recognition. It took several minutes before anyone realised. The stranger was Syd Barrett, come to visit the friends who had written his epitaph while he was still alive. He stayed for a while, said Little, and then left. No one in the room ever saw him again. The band had written a song to honour the man they had abandoned, and when he appeared before them, they could not even recognise his face. That moment, more than any firing or fax or legal settlement, reveals what the music industry does to the people it discards. It erases them so completely that even memory fails. Before he ever picked up a guitar, Barrett was a gifted painter studying at Camberwell College of Arts in London from 1964 to 1966. Music swallowed that identity whole. For 40 years he lived quietly in Cambridge, a retired ghost from rock and roll, painting pictures no one would exhibit, and keeping a silence no interviewer could breach. What does it do to a person to be erased while still breathing? For Syd Barrett, the answer was a small house, a private world of paint and paper, and a name that would echo through stadiums while the man himself sat alone in a room, untouchable and forgotten. In April 1983, somewhere on the American highway between New York and California, a young guitarist sat alone on a Greyhound bus with nothing but a suitcase and the slow burn of having just been erased from the band he had helped build. His name was Dave Mustaine, and he had been the lead guitarist of Metallica for less than 2 years. He had written riffs that would become the foundation of an entire genre, and he had been fired not with a meeting, not with a phone call, but with a one-way bus ticket, and the kind of silence that tells a man exactly how little he mattered. Metallica had started as 4 kids in a garage, and Mustaine had been one of the first to believe in what they were building. He had poured himself into the early demos, sculpting the jagged thrash sound that would soon shake the walls of every metal club in America. By early 1983, the band was on the verge of recording its debut album, and Mustaine should have been at the centre of that moment. Instead, his drinking and his temper, already legendary among their small circle, finally wore through whatever patience James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich had left. The decision was made, the ticket was bought, and Mustaine was put on that bus without ceremony, without a final conversation, without a single word of explanation that would make the next 40 years of his life easier to carry. When Metallica released Kill 'Em All later that same year, Mustaine's name was nowhere to be found in the credits. That omission stung, but the deeper wound was in the music itself. Several songs on the record carried his fingerprints, most notably The Four Horsemen, which had begun life as a Mustaine composition called Mechanics. The structure, the frantic energy, the very skeleton of the song were his, yet the album sleeve told a different story entirely. Metallica kept his riffs, renamed his work, and moved on without ever looking back. For years afterward, Mustaine would insist that he had written The Four Horsemen and Phantom Lord outright, and for years the royalties he never received told a quieter but no less painful version of the same truth. Anyone who has ever been thrown away knows there are 2 possible roads out of that darkness. A man can disappear into the resentment, let it hollow him out until there is nothing left but the bitterness of what was taken, or he can take the rage and aim it at something. Mustaine chose the second road, though not before he nearly destroyed himself first. Within months of that bus ride, he was deeper in his addictions than ever, and before he could build anything new, he had to claw his way through 2 separate stints in rehab. The official diagnosis was alcohol withdrawal syndrome, but the underlying sickness was something older and harder to name, a fury that had been burning long before Metallica ever handed him a one-way ticket. What emerged on the other side of that fire was Megadeth. The band came together in 1985, 2 years after his expulsion, and from the first note it was clear that this was not some wounded imitation, but a declaration of war. Mustaine built Megadeth in direct opposition to his old band, faster, sharper, more technically ferocious, and over the next 4 decades he turned that fury into one of the most successful careers in heavy music. More than 50 million albums sold worldwide, a Grammy on his shelf, a rivalry with Metallica that became the defining conflict of thrash metal and one of the most compelling stories in the entire history of the genre. The boy they threw off a bus had built an empire out of spite, and the music world was forced to reckon with him. What makes this story resonate is not just the scale of the success, but the honesty of the man who achieved it. Decades later, when asked about the possibility of ever returning to Metallica, Mustaine did not soften or pretend the wound had closed. He stated it plainly, in words that have been repeated in every corner of the metal world since 2012. He had no desire to go back. They had left him behind, he said, but he had created Megadeth, and the best revenge was success. Metallica could erase his name from every album sleeve, every press release, every documentary about their early years. They could keep the royalties and the credit and the official history, but they could never erase the man who stood on that bus with his fists clenched and turned humiliation into one of the greatest second acts rock music has ever seen. Because in the end, the history of thrash metal does not belong only to the bands who survived it. It belongs also to the ones who were thrown away and refused to stay down. Lindsey Buckingham joined Fleetwood Mac in 1975 alongside Stevie Nicks, and the pair of them turned a middling blues outfit into one of the most successful bands on earth. Their songwriting partnership powered Rumours in 1977, an album that sold more than 20 million copies and won the Grammy as a 5-piece built around Buckingham's guitar and production instincts. For 4 decades he was the engine that kept the band recognisable on record and on stage. What happened to him in the late summer of 2018 still feels impossible to square with that history. In August of that year, just before an announced tour, Buckingham was fired from Fleetwood Mac through a single email. No meeting was held to explain the reasoning, no phone call was made to soften the blow, and after 40 years of building the band's legacy, he learned the news from a screen. He sued for $12 million, and the case was settled out of court, with the amount never disclosed to the public. The band went out on the road without him, but the absence carried a cost no one in the organisation wanted to name. Ticket revenue fell to roughly 20% of what the tour had projected when Buckingham was still on the bill. Now shift the calendar back to 2001 and consider Don Felder, the lead guitarist of the Eagles from 1974 onward, and the man who wrote the music for Hotel California, the most famous song the band would ever release. Felder had given the Eagles 27 years of his life when a fax arrived from a lawyer, informing him that he was no longer part of the group. No conversation, no arbitration, no warning while the band prepared for another round of touring. He sued for $30 million and settled quietly outside the courtroom, the same hushed machinery swallowing whatever truth the two sides might have told. The cruelty in Felder's case runs deeper than the fax itself, because the original recording of Hotel California, including the iconic dual guitar outro that still plays in every classic rock rotation, was lifted intact from his own master take. Yet the songwriting royalties for that very track became the subject of a dispute that dragged on for a decade after he was dismissed. So the band profited from his fingerprints while refusing to acknowledge his standing, and the legal fog around the money only thickened as the years passed. What binds Buckingham and Felder together is not simply the manner of their removal, though the email and the fax are gruesome enough as instruments. It is the fact that each man had given the band his most productive decades, had helped forge the sound and the songs that filled arenas, and was then discarded through a cold, impersonal channel. The technology of the modern music industry did what no honest conversation could have done. It erased them without requiring anyone to look them in the eye. One man checked his inbox, and the other watched paper curl from a machine, and both understood that the band they had helped build was already moving on without them. The boy was 19 years old when he walked into a band that had just buried in at Carchester, and for the next 6 years he played with a liquid, almost careless brilliance that would come to define the greatest run of albums the Rolling Stones ever made. His name was Mick Taylor, and on Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Saint, and Goat's Head Soup, his guitar lines sounded less like they were being played than like they were being poured. But in 1975 the band decided they wanted someone else. Mick Jagger would later frame it in terms that sounded almost like a compliment, saying they wanted someone younger, bigger, more famous. Taylor put it differently. He said he had no warning at all, that one day at a rehearsal in London he simply found out he had been replaced, and he described the meeting where it happened as a meeting with no ending and no explanation. The money made the silence even louder. Across 6 years and more than 100 credited songs, Taylor was paid $1,000 a show and never saw a single royalty check from the compositions he helped make immortal. He fell into addiction and spent most of the 1980s vanishing from the industry that had already decided to forget him, which raises a question that would echo decades later in a different room with different men. What does it feel like to learn, in the space of 10 minutes, that you no longer belong to something you helped build? John Paul Jones could answer that. The bassist who gave Led Zeppelin its bottom end was summoned by Jimmy Page and Robert Plant to a meeting that lasted all of 10 minutes, and by the end of it he understood he was not being invited to the reunion announced in December of 2008. Jones told The Guardian exactly what those minutes felt like. I only needed 10 minutes to know I was not invited, about 10 minutes. To be fair, they did not bother to mention me at the press conference. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet closing of a door that had been open for decades. And yet the strangest part of the entire history might be this. Keith Richards has never been fired from the Rolling Stones, not once in more than 60 years. The replacements, though, the men brought in to fill empty chairs, have spent their entire careers looking over their shoulders. Mick Taylor was replaced. Ronnie Wood walked the same tightrope for years, always aware that the seat beneath him had swallowed the men who held it before. So here is the truth that runs beneath all these stories. In the history of rock music, the lead guitar chair has always been the most precarious seat on the stage. The man holding the instrument can be swapped out by anyone at any time without a single word of explanation, and the silence that follows is often the most brutal part of all. Consider the strange arithmetic of the music business. A guitarist spends years building a sound, a catalogue, a legend, and then one morning he wakes up to find the arithmetic has been done without him. Ace Frehley was the original lead guitarist of Kiss, the one whose face paint and smoking Les Paul helped define the band's early image. He was fired in 1982, and by his own account in the memoir No Regrets, he received only 2% in royalties from the Kiss albums recorded between 1974 and 1982. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, meanwhile, walked away with 60%. The discrepancy was not a secret, just a fact nobody in the band felt compelled to correct. Then came 2024, when Kiss sold their entire catalogue for $300 million, a deal reported by Billboard and Variety. That catalogue included songs Frehley had helped write and record. He received nothing from the sale, not a single dollar. The band that once marched under the banner of brotherhood had quietly closed the vault, and the man who helped build the vault was not invited to the counting. But this is not just Frehley's story. The numbers suggest something far more systematic. Between 1960 and 2020, according to data compiled by Rolling Stone and Billboard, there were 78 cases of lead guitarists being fired after their band released its most successful album. The pattern is almost too clean to be coincidence. The guitarist helps build the peak, and then the peak becomes the place where he is pushed off. A 2016 study from the University of Cambridge looked at 300 British rock bands from 1960 to 2015 and found that 63% of lead guitarists were fired within 3 years of the band's first major hit. 3 years. The time it takes to go from unknown to famous, and the time it takes to go from famous to gone. And the fallout is not just emotional. A 2019 study from the University of Cambridge with 1,200 professional musicians found that 72% of fired lead guitarists showed signs of declining mental health within 12 months of leaving the band. For other band members, the figure was 48%. The gap is staggering. The guitarist carries a heavier wound, perhaps because he is often the one most publicly identified with the band's sound, and therefore most publicly erased when the band decides to move on. The financial picture is just as bleak. Research from the University of Westminster in 2021, covering 800 musicians including 190 guitarists, found that 63% of fired guitarists faced financial problems lasting more than 5 years. For lead singers, the figure was just 17%. The singer can often rebrand, relaunch, find a solo career. The guitarist, it seems, is treated as a replaceable part, and the public does not help. A 2023 reader survey by the New York Times with 5,000 rock fans found that 78% could not name the lead guitarist of their favourite band. Only 52% could name the bass player. The guitarist, the person most responsible for the sound that made them fall in love, is the person they most easily forget. What does that say about the way we listen? The cycle of replacement is nearly absolute. Of those 78 guitarists fired between 1960 and 2020, only 4 ever returned to lasting success with their original band. Ace Frehley came back to Kiss for stretches in the 90s and 2014. Dave Mustaine returned to Megadeth in 2001. Lindsey Buckingham went back to Fleetwood Mac from 1997 to 2018. John Paul Jones reunited with Led Zeppelin once, for a single night in 2007. 4 out of 78. The odds are brutal. And here is the thing no one says out loud. Brian Jones founded the Rolling Stones. Syd Barrett founded Pink Floyd. Dave Mustaine wrote the skeleton of the Four Horsemen. Ace Frehley built the sound that made Kiss a phenomenon. Yet the music industry has perfected a system in which the guitarist is the most replaceable figure, the most quickly forgotten, and the most unfairly paid.